Hello, good evening. Thank you very much indeed for coming. It's a pleasure to see so many people here. I'm Rowley Keating, I'm Chief Executive here at the British Library. And tonight we have the First World War, the debate. And I think the fact that this is a sold-out event gives a sense of just how much energy, curiosity, passion, and just desire, really, to think and reflect there is in the air, particularly, I think, in the last month or so. I think ever since this historical debate found its way deep into the political consciousness, into the public life of the nation, Michael Gove's intervention, the response from Sir Richard Evans, something happened that made us want to take this further. And I hope one of the things the British Library can do as an institution is provide, if you like, a safe space for big ideas to be thought through and for people to understand and question and maybe question themselves. And I'm sure that's what's going to happen over the next hour and a half. We try to do other things here as well, particularly in commemoration of the 1914-18 conflict. We are a research library. We're very proud, of course, to be able to put primary research materials out there onto the web, increasingly, for everyone to have access to and explore. Some of you may be familiar with the Europeana 1914-18 project, where collections all over Europe are being published online together, some 400,000 items never before available, not just from the traditional archival collections, but also materials from personal collections. There have been road shows all over Europe where private papers have been brought out, and we've participated in that. From that material, we've also published very recently our own website for an educational purpose primarily. It's focused on what can be done for young people in classrooms, but I hope you will all find our World War I website, because there's material of great interest for anyone interested in the period. And beyond that, as the year unfolds, there'll be events, conferences. Kate Adie will be here talking about women and the war. And June the 19th, we'll see the opening of a free exhibition in our main public space here at the library called Enduring War, Grief, Grit and Humour, about the personal experience, home front and on the front, how people coped. And of course, that's what journals and poems and manuscripts can reveal so clearly. We're also an active research institution, and I'm delighted to say it is one of our active researchers, one of the collaborative doctoral students we have working here, Vincent Trott, and in fact he's working with Annika on the panel, who suggested that we do this, that the moment had come, and we should seize the moment to have the debate. And thank you, Vince, wherever you are, but I'm delighted that from a spark like that, we can assemble such a distinguished panel. I'm not going to do that introduction, however. I'm going to hand to our chair for the evening, historian and journalist Paul Lay, former editor, founding editor, in fact, of BBC History magazine, a senior research fellow at the University of Buckingham. He's on the advisory board of the Institute of Historical Research, but you may well know him as the editor of History Today. Paul, please introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Rowley. We've got a very distinguished panel here. I should say something about the way this came about. It was a great initiative by the British Library, because it actually came about from a Twitter conversation that was born of the debate that, well, we'll call it a controversy between Gove and Richard Evans and Tristram Hunt that was there, and people like Simon Sharma became involved, and Gary Sheffield, I think, was the main agent there. And Gary is one of our guests today, and the BL responded tremendously quickly and put together this debate. It didn't even feature in the What's On listings. And I think that the number of people who've turned up here is practically a sold-out event. 280 people shows that Great War fatigue has not set in yet. And it looks as though it won't at all. So anyway, I will introduce you to the panel. On my far left is Gary Sheffield, who is Professor of War Studies at the University of Wolverhampton, where he's a recent appointment. He was formerly at Birmingham University, and he's written mainly, I suppose, he's most famous for his work on Douglas Haig, which is, of course, revisionism, He's associated with Somme, The Forgotten Victory, the First World War, Myths and Realities, all fantastic books that have reassessed entirely our understanding of the First World War. On my left is Dr. Annika Mombauer, who is Senior Lecturer in Modern European History at the Open University. And I think that anyone who wants to engage with the First World War and really wants to go back to the sources should get a copy of Origins of the First World War, Controversies and Consensus, and a recent publication from Oxford University too that looks at the sources there. You can actually look at hear the words from the horse's mouth there. And it's very, very valuable to go back to those sources and to see and escape anachronism and hear the voices of the period. On my right is Dr. Dan Todman, who's Senior Lecturer at Queen Mary University of London, who engages with the social, military and cultural history of the Great War, looking at its course and its legacy in particular, and he's the author of the book The Great War, Myth and Memory. And on my far right, though not necessarily politically, is Dr. Neil Faulkner, who is a research fellow at Bristol University and, interestingly, a First World War archaeologist, a high-profile Marxist historian, it says here, and he is a politically engaged one too. He wrote the Stop the War Coalition pamphlet, No Glory, The Real History of the First World War. So we have a wide range of opinions here, but we also have serious academic engagement with the subject. And I think that's very important because no subject is quite as riddled with myth as the First World War. And I think what we want to do today is to do what Hugh Strawn has asked us to do, and that is engage in controversy. That controversy is the means by which we will best understand this war, but controversy, contention that is informed by the tremendous amount of academic history that's been produced in recent times. Myths do arise very quickly. I was thinking of Michael Gove's intervention. I'm not one of those people who just has a knee-jerk negative reaction to Gove. Some things he says are interesting, some things aren't, and some things are faintly ridiculous. And what was ridiculous was the point about the arguments over the origins of the First World War, of the apportioning of guilt and blame being a left-right split. It's certainly anything but that. If one considers that John Charmley, Neil Ferguson, Dominic Sandbrook, John Redwood, and of course originally Alan Clark are of the left, then one is confused. But those are all people who have argued that Britain did not benefit or Britain should not have taken part in the First World War. So I want to start this debate by going in at the deep end and by asking each of the speakers to mark out their positions as to the origins of the First World War, where guilt, where blame is manifest, if indeed it is at all. So I'll start with Dan Todman.
Well, actually, I think it's interesting to be asked to place yourself in that position as a result of a debate initiated by Michael Gove to promote his own position as scourge of the left, rather than to make any kind of contribution to the history of the First World War. But along with Paul, I think sometimes there's a function for people driving debate, even if that's not actually their intention is different from that of historians. For me, what's interesting about that rather manufactured debate was how much it focused on Britain's participation rather than the mechanics of Europe going to war. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, and as ever, these discussions were about, were as if they were sort of ab initio, as if nobody had thought about these issues before, whereas actually it's a kind of tribute to 100 years of Britain's debating. Is this a war that was worth it? Was it worthwhile? Should Britain enter? So I think we need to recognise this is something which was controversial at the time and which has continued to be controversial since. And in a way, that's a distinctly British argument in the sense that it's because Britain has a choice about whether it takes part in 1914 in a way that other countries I don't think feel they have the same way. It's not invaded. So I think identifying this as a distinctly British argument is probably something that I'm most interested in. That's a way of avoiding taking a position.
Well, let me try and force you on that then. Did they make the right decision by taking part?
Well, I see. Depends what you mean by right. That's a good historian's answer, isn't it? Because it seems to me that if we make an argument, if we accept an argument that Britain needs to take part for sort of geopolitical reasons, which might be an argument, for example, that Gabby might make now, well, I won't cast him into a particular position, but then we have to accept there's a particular value to the nation that exists in 1914, and perhaps we have to draw linkages to the one that exists now. I think that's why I'm anxious about saying this is something that is right for Britain to do, because whilst it may have been right for the Britons of 1914, and many of them certainly thought they were engaged in a righteous conflict, I think that the Britain of 2014 is so different from the Britain of 1914 that it would be very dangerous to say this is a just war, for example, because to me that's to draw on the rhetoric of the time to, in a sort of false way. Does it matter to Britain that it ends up on the winning side if there's a war to be won? If the war is going to be fought, Britain, it's an important facet of British history in the 20th century that it's on the winning side. I don't think you can understand what happens in Britain in the 20s and 30s, its reaction to the course of the rest of 20th century history without saying victory matters. But that's not the reason that it enters battle in the summer of 1914.
And of course, even victory, in terms of someone like Ferguson, would be Pyrrhic. But we'll probably deal with those issues later. Annika, your position.
Okay, well, I think I completely agree with you that this focus on Britain is important and also somewhat curious. We talk of the First World War, but actually what we're looking at, we're always just looking at Britain's war. We're always looking at the Western Front and all the associations we have with the war. So it's quite important to think of the origins internationally, but also to think of this debate internationally. And while we've been debating in this country, in Germany, a parallel debate has been going on, which is very interesting. And at the moment, I think it's no longer parallel, but the two have crossed. So here we've debated, I'd say until about 6 weeks ago, the main debate was about how to commemorate the war. There wasn't really much debate that it should be commemorated, and I'm sure all of us would agree that something should happen to commemorate the war, but how do you commemorate it? And historians have been quite worried about the fact that the government seemed to only want to commemorate defeats, rather than perhaps also the fact that some battles were actually won, and that in the end, Britain was, as we just said, on the winning side. That debate hasn't taken place at all in Germany, where the government doesn't want to commemorate the war at all. There are local, regional initiatives, but there is no concern by the German government to commemorate the war in a national way. So the debate, while we've now been debating what Gove and others have said in this really fascinating debate, and I love the fact that what we all do for a day job has suddenly just become what everybody's interested in, and that's just really wonderful. But while we've been debating whether or not the war was futile for Britain, in Germany they've been debating whether or not Germany actually caused the war, because they've in a way got their get-out-of-jail card in the form of a couple of publications that have made a huge splash in Germany, one of which is Chris Clark's Sleepwalkers, which has been available in German translation since September and is an absolute barnstorming success. Last I heard, he'd sold 160,000 copies. I mean, that's something I'm sure we can all just dream about. And I would say until quite recently, I don't want to talk for you, but I dream about that. But until quite recently, I'd say unless it was a book about the Second World War, you had no chance of ever topping the bestseller lists. But suddenly, the First World War is very present in Germany, and the debate there is about whether or not Germany caused it, and the current consensus is, well, actually, no, Germany didn't cause it, it was everyone. And where the two debates now merge is that some German historians have picked up on this futility argument, and they are quite certain that Britain could have stayed out of the war, and it's quite astonishing to read that. They say that Britain was pretty much the only country who had no actual reason to go to war in 1914, and that it was the entry of Britain into the war that turned that European war into a global war. So they completely turn it on its head, which is really quite astonishing and worrying to read. But in terms of declaring a position, after 100 years, I'd still say that essentially the Allies got it right in 1919, and that Germany is more to blame than anyone else, and that Britain should not have stayed out of the war. I think we're approaching this with hindsight, but what we need to do is look at what were the options for Sir Edward Grey in 1914. And I just can't see how he could possibly have decided for Britain to stay neutral. It wasn't possible because it's not just Germany that's threatening Britain, it's also Russia. In the understanding of the Foreign Office, Russia will be, by 1916-17, everybody in Europe thinks Russia will be an invincible power. So what can Sir Edward Grey do? He can stay neutral, then he's let down France and Russia. He's no longer got a credible ally on the continent. There is really actually no choice that I can see for a different decision. So it's not really a very an apt question to ask. Could they have stayed out? Because in that constellation in 1914, and given the values that people had, I mean, James Joel speaks of unspoken assumptions. There are actually lots of spoken assumptions. They're about honor, they're about prestige. These are things that today we can't really quite understand anymore. But at the time, Austria-Hungary did go to war partly because of prestige and honor. Those were the reasons. And Britain and Germany and France and Russia all thought in those terms. So I think they needed, that their hand was forced. They needed to enter this war, but their hand was forced primarily by Germany.
No, thank you, Annika. I'm sure we'll discuss Christopher Clark's Sleepwalkers later. I mean, do you think, just a quick question, is part of the appeal of that in Germany, because I was astonished by the number of copies it sold, I found out last week. Is that because it presents, dare I say it, a flattering picture of Germany in 1914 and in the build-up to that?
Well, I think that would do Chris Clark a disservice. The
No,
book
not
is
Chris Clark. I'm talking about the commercial success.
Oh, right, the commercial. Well,
no, it's a fine
yeah.
piece of scholarship.
Yes, it is a fine piece of scholarship. It is also extremely well written, and it was published and marketed at just the right moment in time. So he's lucky in that his book was the first. Now there is an absolute avalanche of books on the First World War, also in Germany. And it's, I think, much harder now to stake that claim. Most people who bought the book will probably only buy one whopper of a book. They're not going to go and read everything that there is. So it was partly timing. It's partly that it's very readable. But it is also that a lot of people in the media and in the German public, where this has been debated in an unprecedented way. It really reminds me of the Fischer controversy of the 1960s, where there was a similar interest and a similar public debate that you don't normally get in this way. And it is, you get, for example, one thing that you can do is look on Amazon and other such sites for the comments that people leave. And it is absolutely astonishing how many comments, how long, how knowledgeable people are, but also how they do say, well, finally, somebody says it wasn't us. We can't have been, the baddies in everything. And the fact that he's not German is particularly significant and often pointed out. He's an Australian scholar working in Cambridge. He's got no, ulterior motives. He's got no axe to grind. If he says it wasn't us, then I guess it wasn't us. So. Yeah.
Okay, Neil, what's your position?
Well, you see, it's very interesting that Annika refers to Sir Edward Grey and poses the question, what should Sir Edward Grey do? And there's a tendency, I think, among academic historians to assume that if they were to be transported back to the period that they study, 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 200 years ago, they would be reincarnated as a great statesman or general or a senator if they study the ancient world or whatever. And I want to suggest that we really need to think about the First World War in a different way, because there are two ways of looking at history. There have been two ways of looking at history, actually, for about 5,000 years, since the world was divided into rich and poor. And in 1914, there were two Europes. Not just two Europes in the sense that there was an Entente alliance and a Central Powers alliance. There was another sense, a more important sense, in which there were two Europes. There was a Europe of rulers, of industrialists, of bankers, and of generals. And if you view history from above, that's what you see. And you see one group of bankers and industrialists and generals gathered around a Union Jack in one place. And as you pan across, you see another group of bankers and industrialists and generals gathered around a French tricolour. And then you pan around a little further and you see another group of them gathered around a German cross. And they're competing with each other. They're competing for empire. They're competing for markets. They're competing for raw materials. They've gobbled up the rest of the planet among themselves, and now that war for empire and profit has rebounded into Europe, created an arms race, and that plunges Europe into war, a war of the great powers, a war of the great empires in 1914. That's what you see if you look at the top, if you take the perspective of Sir Edward Grey. But there's another way of looking at 1914. You can look from below. You can look at the experience of the mine worker on strike against poverty pay in South Wales and compare him with the mine worker on strike against poverty pay in the Rhineland, or the Czech mine worker in Bohemia, or the Russian mine worker in the Don Basin. And their enemy isn't other mine workers who've been put into uniform and sent by their rulers to kill foreign mine workers. Their enemy is the mine boss. You can look at history that way. You can look at history from the perspective of the suffragettes fighting for the right to vote, who have no say in whether or not the British ruling class decides to go to war in 1914. You can look at the war from the perspective of the Irish nationalist, for whom the enemy is the British Empire, not Germany. You can look at it from the perspective of the Indian nationalist. Let's remind ourselves that the British, who in 1914 adopt a holier-than-thou attitude to Germany, arguing that Germany is the aggressor, Germany is autocratic, Germany is threatening the peace of Europe. It was the British who controlled a fifth of the world's landmass and a quarter of the world's population. Hundreds of millions of people living under British imperial rule in order to enrich a tiny minority of bankers and industrialists at the top of British society, and the British ruling class, in defence of that empire and in defence of that wealth, were willing to plunge Britain into a war that cost 15 million lives. Look at history from below, and it's not a question about what Sir Edward Grey should have done, but a question about what ordinary people should have done when their rulers made the decision to plunge Europe into 4 years of modern industrialised slaughter. If what happened between 1914 and 1918 isn't madness, isn't a world gone mad, isn't the proof that this system was a dysfunctional system, I don't know what is.
Sorry, are you I'm just interested to know whether you're... So, are you saying... Are you talking about what the European working class should have done or what they did?
Do you want me to come straight back?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess because I take a lot of your points about Britain. The British Empire is not something one would now wish to fight for, and it being a war of empires, that's an important way to think about it. But it strikes me that there's an awful lot of South Wales miners who end up joining the armed forces. There's a lot of people across Europe who end. One of the great factors of explaining that outbreak of war is the failure of European socialism to prevent it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is absolutely right. And it seems to me that the leaders of the mainstream socialist parties and the trade unions in 1914 across Europe, with some noble exceptions, but they were a minority, betrayed the interests of their own supporters. I would put it as strongly as that, because the socialist parties organised together in a second international, and many of the trade unions had passed resolutions year after year after year at their conferences in the run-up to war, saying, we will take mass action against war if it's declared. I mean, many of them were committed to calling general strike action to stop the war. My view is they should have acted on that, and then we would have avoided the 4 years of war between 1914 and 1918. We wouldn't have had to wait for that eruption of anti-war opinion from below that finally does bring the war to an end in 1917 and 1918, but only after 15 million people have been killed.
And with very poor terms that are imposed by Germany there as well. But beyond that, do you not think, just one question that rises out of that, and I very much agree about the importance of understanding history from below as well as above, but the way it's understood now, there could be an argument that the social history, the way we understand what has become social history, at least so far as public history goes, has become divorced from the politics and the diplomacy, so that we see it very much as solipsistic kind of who do we think we are culture, where we trace our family, we trace our culture. We no longer, perhaps it's due to the decline of Marxism, one of the sad parts of the decline of Marxism is that we no longer think of those social structures in terms of at least the way public history is presented. And so the kind of arguments that you're making, which are perfectly valid arguments, are not ones that are really getting through to the wider public, because we tend to concentrate on the individual and then we can tend to concentrate on the high politics and don't merge the two anymore. But anyway, let's move to Gary Sheffield, who I think will have probably different take on this. Gary.
Well, I was rather embarrassed by Michael Gove's comments because he sort of fingered me implicitly as a right-wing historian. I'm a soft, squishy Guardian reader, and I had a series of texts from various friends of mine who work in the state school system saying, do you have any influence over your new best friend's policies? Answer, sadly, no. My belief, and I must say I have been very influenced by reading Anneka's work and work of many other historians, is that war was caused in 1914 by the deliberate and conscious decision of the ruling elite of two states, of Austria-Hungary and of Germany. Austria clearly used the assassination of the Archduke as a pretext to go to war with Serbia. They wanted to crush Serbia for a matter of prestige. It was the Balkans was the last place in Europe that the Austrians could still throw their weight around. And it seems very clear to me that they were determined to go to war no matter what. What I think is the crucial activity of the Germans, and I certainly would agree with Anneka that the Germans are very largely to blame, was the issuing of the so-called blank check, the blanket guarantee of support for Austria no matter what they were going to do. And both Austria and Germany, the leaders, we're talking about very small groups, very cliques in both cases, took those decisions in the full knowledge of the likely outcome, which would be that a war would not be confined to the Balkans, that it would bring in Russia, which ran the hugely strong risk of converting it into a general European war. Now, some historians, Fritz Fischer's already been mentioned, John Roll, whose magisterial third volume of his biography of the Kaiser has just appeared, would argue that there is conscious intent by the Germans to seek to carve out an empire in Europe. Others would say, okay, maybe that's not precisely what they're aiming to do, but at the very least, the German elite are prepared to run the risk of bringing about a war like that in order to achieve, at the bare minimum, breaking up the entente of France and Russia with Britain on the sidelines. Peacefully, okay, but if it comes to war, so be it. So the very best thing you can say about the leaders of Germany and Austria-Hungary is they were prepared to take criminal risks. I use the word advisedly, with the peace of Europe. It strikes me that the Sleepwalkers thesis very much speaks to our time, to a time in which we don't want to allocate blame. Chris Clark and Richard Evans actually gone on record as saying that we should get away from the blame game. This strikes me as being frankly ahistorical, that the evidence to me is absolutely clear. Whatever their motivations, those two states bear the war guilt, the huge burden of the war guilt. Whatever you might say about the leaders of Britain, France, and particularly Russia, their actions, I think, were largely defensive and reactive. Could Britain stay out of the war? No, it couldn't. The geopolitical reasons, which Dan has already referred to, I think are desperately important. If we see the British decision to go to war in 1914 as part of a continuum that goes back at least to the age of Queen Elizabeth, that's to keep the Low Countries, the Netherlands and Belgium, out of the hands of a hostile power, particularly a hostile naval power, is one of the primary principles upon which British security and foreign policy are constructed. The wider issue, of course, is the balance of power. Britain has historically sought to prevent the domination of Europe by any one power, and thus allied with Germany, or at least German states, against France under Napoleon, and allied with France against Germany 100 years later. Britain basically went into the Second World War in 1939 for the same reason, joined NATO in 1949 for essentially the same reason. The other issue, which I must say has actually loomed much, I've come to believe is much more important than I did when I did some writing on this about a decade ago, is the moral case. It's clear to me that people in Britain, particularly the nonconformist conscience, were so outraged by the invasion of Belgium, Germany ripping up a treaty, that it certainly brought, I think, Asquith's government into the war more or less united. It brought Lloyd George on board, certainly. We've got so used to politicians lying, we think nothing of it anymore. But in 1914, they thought differently. So the moral case, as well as the strategic case, I think is absolutely critical. The final thing I'll say, actually, is even if we could sort of, somehow wave a magic wand and discover that Chris Clark's Sleepwalker's thesis is in fact correct, the way that Germany then proceeded to behave once war had broken out, with the September programme, not only the policy but the plans, or the actual policy of annexations in East and West, the treatment of occupied states, and the threat, the absolute dire threat that this posed to the very existence of Britain as a sovereign state, makes the First World War, for all the fact it's a terrible, absolutely ghastly experience, a war which had to be fought and had to be won. Nobody in Britain really wanted war in 1914. I think if Germany had avoided going through Belgium, I think there's an extremely good chance Britain would have either stayed out of the war altogether or possibly have not come in until several weeks or even months later because the Asquith government had fallen apart, which I think probably would have meant that Germany would have won and France and Russia would have lost. It's not a war anybody in Britain really wanted in 1914, but it's a war that people at the time, from the very top of society, the very bottom, recognised the threat and recognised it as a war that had to be fought and had to be endured. I'll put my hands on my cards on the table. I'm, for one, profoundly glad that our ancestors took that decision, fought the war, and ended up on the winning side.
Thank you, Gary.
Can I just
make one point? I've got a quote here. It's very interesting what you say about the reluctance that there was in Britain to fight. I'm sure that's true. I've got a quote here from a leftish academic journalist, Gilbert Murray, who very much opposed the war and wrote in 1915, "I've never till this year seriously believed in the unalterably aggressive designs of Germany. Now I see that on a large part of this question I was wrong, and a large number of people whom I honour most were wrong. One is vividly reminded of Lord Melbourne's dictum, all the sensible men were on one side and all the damned fools on the other, and egad, sir, the damned fools were right." Now, the damned fools he's talking about were people like Lord Roberts, Lord Kitchener, Lord Milner, people who wanted to create, in the years running up to the war, a much stronger army. The British army was very, very small. It relied on its naval power for its strength. Is there any sense that the war could have been avoided had Britain been more militaristic?
Well, the argument has certainly been made that if Britain had introduced conscription, had effectively had a continental army to back up its quasi-alliance with Britain, with France and Russia before 1914. That's a possibility. But of course, it was never going to happen because Britain before 1914 was simply never going to allow conscription to come in. So yes, might be, but really not, I think, worth debating because it was never going to happen. It was never practical politics.
But also, I can't see that it's in Britain, if we're talking national interests, I can't see that it's in Britain's national interests to fight like France and Germany or Russia when it's not France or Germany or Russia. It's the world, it's the workshop of the world. Yeah. It doesn't have an agricultural peasant class. Yeah. You know, what it's very good at is making stuff. Yeah. So it should fight a war based on high technology, which is what it does.
Well, exactly.
You know, so, and of course, you're sort of, you know, if you say that Britain should have had a big army, well, you know, you're kind of missing out the role that the British Navy plays in eventually winning the war. You know, so I think I'm not sure that just because Gilbert Murray thought that the damned fools were right, that Kitchener was right to say we ought to have a bigger army. It's interesting, of course, it doesn't end up being deployed in the way he wanted it deployed anyway, which has led everybody else in Europe fight themselves to a standstill and then determine the peace. You know, so wars don't end up how people think they're going to be at the start.
Was there any means, historians refer to the Court of Arbitration at The Hague, for example, was there any peaceful means by which it could have been resolved through such methods as arbitration? Neil, I mean, are you aware of any such methods?
That could have avoided the conflict?
That could have avoided the conflict, that were based upon Congress?
No, not really, because you see, if you have a world which is divided, as the world of 1914 was, between rival European nation-states, creating empires and spheres of influence in America, Asia, and Africa, and building great armies to back their position both in Europe and in the wider world, you don't have the material basis for international cooperation to resolve conflicts of this nature. You have to overturn what was a profoundly, and still is, a profoundly dysfunctional global system, where instead of having a world in which there is international unity and solidarity and a resolution of human problems collectively and democratically in a rational way by agreement of us all as a species, if you have a world that is divided in this way into nation states and corporations that are competing with each other, if that's the dynamic of the system, it doesn't matter what international institutions you set up. It doesn't matter if you set up a League of Nations. It doesn't matter if you set up a United Nations. It doesn't matter what kind of international organisation you set up. You are not going to be able to prevent war, which is intrinsic to a system which is divided and competitive in the way the modern capitalist world is the world that has given us a century of war. Okay. It's a pipe dream.
Yes, there could have been. The war could have been stopped by international mediation. Sir Edward Grey, on six separate occasions, proposed either an international conference or mediation. Now, in the past 2 years, that is 1912, 1913, the Balkan Wars, had seen a revival of the old concert of Europe, actually the great powers sitting around a table, both to prevent the war from spreading and actually to decide in some cases on, to put it crudely, which state was going to get which chunk of territory. And all the indications from 1912, 1913 was that Grey actually was quite sympathetic to the Habsburg case. Vernon Bogdanor had a very important lecture sometime last year, and I think it's coming out it's the core of a book that's coming out later this year, has made the point, I thought very, very, very forcefully, that it is entirely possible, had the Austrians and Germans been serious about peace, which of course they were not, that had they been serious about it, there could have been an international conference ending with Serbia being punished, isolated, although not destroyed. So war could have been avoided. The Austrians could have got some sort of revenge for the assassination. The Russians wouldn't have been drawn in. But such things such peace processes only actually work if the principal parties are serious about it. Russia was serious, France was serious, Britain was serious, Serbia didn't have a choice, I suspect, but serious. Germany and Austria were not.
But it's even worse than that, isn't it? That they actually say in Vienna after the assassination that a diplomatic victory would be odious. we do not want a diplomatic victory. This time, particularly the Chief of Staff in Vienna, Franz Konrad von Hötzendorf, who's been absolutely gagging for a war with Serbia for some time. Every kind of crisis, he wants to have a war with Serbia. This is his moment. The last thing he wants is arbitration or mediation. And as you say, there are all these offers on the table. They get dismissed out of hand in Berlin and in Vienna. And what the leaders in Berlin do is they say, we will pretend to pass on your mediation proposal, but please don't be fooled by this. We don't want you in Vienna to mediate, but we can't lose face. So we have to appear to be in support of the offers that are coming from Sir Edward Grey. And as you say, there's this tradition of solving crises around the conference table. And I can't see why this couldn't have worked again if there'd been the desire to resolve it.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah, sure.
Edward Grey's come under an awful lot of criticism from a whole series of historians, normally for not being tough enough. And I think that completely misunderstands politically how weak he is within the Liberal government, let alone anything else. For me, his biggest mistake is actually believing the international processes which have worked as recently as 6 months before will work in the summer of 1914. I'm sorry. His mistake is believing the Germans, the Austrians are serious about peace when they are not.
But just to follow up on a point that Neil made earlier, I mean, it seems to me that one of the problems with trying to stop the war once it's 2 or 3 years in is the level of popular commitment throughout Europe to it. But actually, these wars can't just be fought by great statesmen. They can only be fought with popular consent. And actually, because there isn't that kind of universal enthusiasm that I think people used to believe in 1914, actually you would have had popular support for a peace settlement, a peaceful resolution in 1914. It would have been politically possible domestically as well as internationally. But of course, once the war is underway, by the time you get to 1916, 1917, that's much harder to achieve because it's politically much more difficult on the home front.
And mentalities are hugely different. I don't think we can underestimate that, can we? The mentality of people there, if you're thinking of the Russian soldier fighting for church and fatherland, Christian patriotic duties, in fact, all the time. Rupert Brooke writes at the beginning, now God be thanked who has watched us with this hour. I mean, these are sentiments that are unimaginable to us. But in terms of the mentality of that period, they are very real. And that is what people believe. And it's very difficult. But I want to try and move on, because I realise we're really racing through time here. And I want to look at the legacy of the war and the way we understood it, and why Britons are so fascinated by it. And I want to look at the idea of a good war versus bad war. When Britons look back at the Second World War, it's almost universally accepted as the right thing to do. It's almost Manichaean in the way of good versus evil. There is little regret, despite the suffering that's endured there. It was the right thing to do. That is not the way, on the whole, the First World War is thought of anymore, and perhaps hasn't been thought of over the last 50 years. And Dan, I wonder if you could talk about the way in which that's changed, because you do get criticism of strategy, for example, even with people like Churchill, Lloyd George, Basil Liddell Hart, right from the beginning. But nevertheless, they sense that the war is still the right thing to have fought. It was still right to go to war, even if the strategy is wrong. We think of books like by Frank Richards, Frederick Manning, J.C. Dunn, that are ambivalent, I suppose, ambiguous about the war, but still relatively positive about the legacy of it. That changes. I wonder if you could sort of chart that change.
I think you've got to be very hesitant about sort of ascribing a single view to Britons in that interwar period, because actually the war is very controversial whilst it's being fought, and it remains very controversial afterwards. But certainly I think there's both a much broader range of opinion which says the conflict was worth fighting and it was for something, and of course it's much harder to say it was worth nothing whilst so many people have lost loved ones. So this was a kind of structural factor in what can actually be said. And of course, that idea, one of the ways that society deals with that idea of this kind of controversy, but simultaneously this great tragedy of so much loss of life, is to try and come to a kind of mutually acceptable meaning. And I think you see that transition from the 1920s going into the 1930s, so that you get this idea that this was a war that's justified by the achievement of peace. Which I think is a very important way, actually, of then looking at Britain's involvement with Europe in the 1930s, and how uncontroversial the start of the Second World War is. It causes much less debate popularly, politically, going to war in September 1939, not least because it's seen as a war for peace. So the sacrifice of 1914-18 will only be justified if Britain stands up for peace, and redeems those dead soldiers. But it's really only, I think, in the post-Second World War era that you have a rewriting of that, the experience of the First World War in more purely negative terms. So, partly that's because you have a comparison. So you can have a good war and a bad war. Britain's Second World War is better in the sense that it loses fewer people. Whether it's, I think one of the other aspects of goodness that we associate with the Second World War is the achievement of sort of social welfare reform at the end of it. Of course, again, what's often forgotten is how important for, in terms of improving the conditions of an awful lot of working class Britons, the experience of the First World War is. The fact that trade unions take advantage of wartime labour shortage to strike and get better rates of pay is... but more particularly, I think, in terms of working class family incomes, just the sheer level of employment, this that makes the First World War a transformative moment as well. And then, of course, wars are always repurposed, revisited over time in history. I don't think that, there's always been an undercurrent of questioning, even when the First World War is seen in more negative terms about, is it really a bad war? So, it's distinctive that we're having a debate today. I think one of the things that actually happens with the remembrance of the First World War is it becomes remembered in terms of debates. Yeah. And those debates can be used to, they're a key part of people's political and personal identities. So actually one of the things that even people who might not know very much about the First World War, they know about, there were some debates, there were some things that people argue about, and I know where I stand on those debates, and that's part of what makes me who I am.
But in fact, the origins of the war, the reasons Britain went to war in both the First and the Second World War are actually quite similar. And when you talk about the effects in terms of labour, in terms of welfare, they are, again, strikingly similar. We did not go to war in the Second World War, however much we like to think that to save the Jews. We did not know about Auschwitz. We went for remarkably similar reasons, for the reasons we fought the First World War.
If you want to say there's a mixture of morality and geopolitics in both times around, I think that's a good way of explaining why British statesmen and population are persuaded to fight twice over.
But we do seem to have a turning point round about the 60s. Everyone remembers the BBC's great series, The Great War, which is still striking now when you see people in their 60s and 70s who fought on the Somme and at Ypres. And you also get the first real public airing of Wilfred Owen's poems in the War Requiem. Oh, What a Lovely War, of course, comes through that. What's that turning point about? What does it represent?
Well, I know Dan would actually place the turning point a little later, which actually I don't agree with him on, but I think we've had many arguments about this. I think the 1960s, it is, I think, the generation actually now viewing the First World War through the prism of the Second World War. The good war refracts the bad war, if I can put it like that. There's a lot of other things going on as well. J.B. Priestley, for example, who writes very movingly in the late 1950s of his experiences of the First World War, but he sees this as through the eyes of I think a founder member of CND, that certainly Oh What a Lovely War, the background to it is the Cold War, and this idea of the First World War is this tragic mistake, and we'd be going down that slippery slide again. I can't remember exactly when Oh What a Lovely War is premiered.
63.
Yes, I know 63, but within 6 months or so of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's very close.
I think it's the second half of 63.
Okay, but we're talking about that sort of reaction. I think the other thing is that there is this more general, the whole, I don't want to overcook this, the whole idea of the 1960s people being hippies and dropping out the rest of it. But there is, I think, undoubtedly a backlash against the, if you like, Edwardian conformism personified by Harold Macmillan. And I think the First World War is caught up with that whole sort of, again, don't make too much of it, but countercultural idea, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Pill, and all the rest of it.
Macmillan's very much the symbol of that.
And he is, of course, Macmillan, as a grenadier officer in the war. Yeah. And I think that the First World War becomes involved in these sort of wider societal changes. And I can't remember whether Dan made this point in his writing or read it somewhere else, but it's also the fact, you do have, at this stage, grandfathers who fought in the war sitting down with their grandchildren and talking about it, their discussions being prompted by watching the Great War TV series and various other things that were going on.
I mean, I think that it's that's where you get that intersection, which in, once you start to analyse, it looks very strange, of Alan Clarke and Joan Littlewood. But of course, I think what links those is Clarke is writing as a sort of this is about a different sort of class struggle. This is the up and coming technocrats versus the old aristocratic elite. Right? So the lesson that part of the point of writing The Donkeys is just to epat the bourgeoisie and make a kind of name for himself, because he'd felt that being a novelist, he wanted to try something new. Right? So the First World War was what it was going to be.
A few bob as well.
Yeah, no, of course. But the standpoint there is of that it's the middle class who are technically adept, wanting to sweep away an older system. Right? So I don't think that's a bit different from hippies and tuning in and dropping out, which I think is much more 1970s. This is a debate that's going on in Britain from the 1930s onwards, and you see it there at the end of the 1930s, this idea of the generals in the last war didn't know what they were doing, they didn't deal with technology well, and it's significant that it's focused so much on technology. It's not an accurate reflection of them, but that thing of, Britain needs to remake itself by being really good at using these new weapons of war is something that you see time and time again.
What's interesting is that the sort of parallel debates that I just sketched out that are happening for the centenary, that also happened for the 50th anniversary, that while in this country these debates were going on, in Germany the debate was again about war guilt. This time round, the argument that it had been Germany's fault was debated in the media, because that had been really very much buried by the late 1930s. Everybody had agreed that it was kind of nobody's fault. In particular, the system had broken down, and that was very comfortable for Germans. So, and the contemporary background to that debate again is significant. I mean, you mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis, but obviously also in the 1960s you have the Berlin Wall. You have the fact that Germany is at the very forefront of the Cold War, and now you get a German historian, not an Australian historian teaching in Cambridge, and a German historian saying it was us, and so that's very uncomfortable. So the debates that Germans have about the war are completely different, and I think apart from the issue of the origins, the First World War itself has never been in any way problematized in Germany. It's never actually been debated. The war itself is just a complete non-topic. It's obviously a non-topic in the immediate years after the war, because the Germans lost the war, and not only do they feel they didn't start it, they also feel they didn't really lose it, but there they are. So you have a different relationship with that war because of its outcome. And then after the Second World War, well, it was just so much more gruesome for Germans than even the First World War. Although startlingly, the civilian deaths are similar, as I hadn't really clocked, but was pointed out to me just earlier. 700,000 German civilians, if you include the influenza dead. But that is completely overlooked in Germany, and really to this day, it is, I'd say, in the last 2 years maybe, that there's this sudden interest in the First World War, which suddenly in Germany is called the Great War. I'm not quite sure why that's significant. I think it is significant. I don't quite know what it means, but suddenly it has just completely changed. The way Germans see the war has completely changed.
I think we are we seem to be shadowing the kind of Gove argument, really, which in its essence is saying that the way we view the First World War is based upon trendy views that were developed in the 1960s. It's reflected in things like Oh, What a Lovely War. It's reflected a little bit later in Blackadder, and so on. That it's, in a sense, that traditional view of the First World War as a construct of relatively recent times. Now, that only works if you can't see what is happening inside European society and inside the European armed forces that are engaged at the time of the First World War. It is absolutely right that a very large proportion of those who were conscripted to fight or volunteered to fight when it broke out in 1914 were gulled by the dominant ideas of the time, the nationalism, the imperialism, the racism, all of the other ideas that were used to mobilize people and get them into the trenches and get them killing workers in uniform and peasants in uniform on the other side. But there was a minority, a significant minority, that opposed it from the very, very beginning. And that minority got bigger and bigger and bigger until across Europe, across the fighting fronts, there was a wave of mutinies and mass desertion and revolutionary movements among the soldiers, which shut down the war on the Eastern Front in 1917 and then shut down the war on the Western Front in 19. And on the home front, a wave of strikes that culminated in a tidal wave of revolution that swept across Europe between 1917 and 1923 and actually brought the entire system, the entire European state system, the entire European capitalist system, close to collapse. We got closer then, I think, than at any other time in human history. That creates the legacy. That creates a mass opinion that says this was an appalling slaughter. And why is it so different, the reaction to what is going on in 1918, than it has been before? It's because war has changed. It's because they have turned war into an industrial process. Up until this point, armies were relatively small. They tended to fight discrete campaigns in particular places, in distant places. What's happening now, from 1914 onwards, is that entire societies are completely engulfed by industrialized slaughter, and the products of human ingenuity, human engineering, human labor are turned into a vast mechanism for the destruction of life. That's why the slaughter is so massive, that's why the reaction is so huge, and that's why we have today a mass anti-war movement. That is the real legacy of the First World War, the size of the anti-war movement in Britain today.
You wish that was the legacy. And in a way, I do wish that was a legacy. I'd be much more pessimistic than you are. I think the really awful lesson of the First War is actually this isn't something that creates a mass anti-war movement in many of the participant countries. The appalling lesson that we have to learn from this conflict is the ability of human societies, which in many ways bring a great deal of good to their members, to self-delude into fighting these these grotesque conflicts, which kill millions of people, which inflict this grotesque damage. But that's not something which is just inflicted on people from above. Sadly, this is something which is driven by popular emotion from below as well. And the German army on the Eastern Front doesn't break down in 1917. Yeah, that's quite significant for what happens on the Eastern Front in 1917. The Allied armies don't break down on the Western Front in 1918. Again, that's quite significant for the outcome of the war. So I think the really interesting point that you raise, and the thing which is significantly absent from all the discussions about commemoration, is how do we commemorate 1917? There's been very little thought about that. But that's actually, once you get into that period of great upheaval that lasts long after 1918, these are actually much more difficult things for national governments to commemorate. And I think one of the things that we'll agree on is Michael Gove, if he's still in office, is going to have a terrible difficulty trying to work out, well, how do you cast a conservative narrative around 1917?
It strikes me that the purchase of the First World War on Britons is as strong as it's ever been, perhaps stronger. And I'm thinking in particular of poppy wearing now, which is far greater and seems much more ubiquitous than it was when I was a child, even though there were people from the First World War there then. Newsreaders stopped putting them on about late September these days. But there was a very interesting point. I want to open this up to the audience next, but there was just one interesting point by an Irish historian. I'm sure you know him, Edward Madigan, who had an interesting point about why the British, and I think he specifically said the English, were so obsessed by the First World War. And he said it was the only opportunity, perhaps, he was just surmising, but he said perhaps it was the only opportunity the English had to present themselves as victims. And I think that's quite an interesting point. But just on that, we can open it up to the you, sir.
Frank Jackson, World Disarmament Campaign. The bizarre thing, the thing that seems to me to be bizarre about this...
Excuse me, can we just have questions, please? Not statements, questions only, please.
Well, I thought we were going to have a debate, actually.
Yeah, we can have a debate, but we need questions to have a debate.
To what extent do you think that the Jameson raid contributed to the First World War?
And by that, you mean the Boer War in general as well, presumably?
The Jameson raid leading into the Boer War.
Yeah. To what extent did the Jameson raid affect the First World War? Gary?
Oh, thanks for that. Okay. I've already said in my opening statement, I think that war was caused by the individual decisions of particular leaders in Austria and Germany. That's not to deny, of course, that there are long-term factors like imperialism, like the arms race, like capitalism, like various other isms, which are important. They're important, I think, in making war not inevitable, but probably more likely. However, I immediately caveat that by saying that the arms race, there is no real evidence that arms races automatically lead to war. The French, British naval arms race late 19th century didn't. Thankfully, the American-Soviet arms race, nuclear arms race of the 70s and 80s didn't. And by 1914, even the Anglo-German arms race had really led with the Germans being defeated in the sense the British had outbuilt them, and so the German plan for undermining the Royal Navy's margin of security had failed. What it had done, of course, was to poison relations between Britain and Germany. It actually took a complete stroke of genius for Britain to get into bed not only with France, traditional enemy, but Russia, its great imperial rival over India. And yes, of course, that's what happened between 1904 and 1907. So, your point, I think, imperialism helped create preconditions in which war might occurred. But to quote David Stevenson, who I think is probably, in my view, one of the shrewdest historians writing on the First World War at the moment, he said, Europe might have been a house of cards in 1914, but it still took somebody to topple the cards.
Lady in the white.
I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. The first is, I'd like to know what the panel thinks about the whole period from the scramble for Africa to 1914, because it seems to me this is absolutely central to the building up of different rivalries, to the way in which you have competition between the big empires, and that this has an effect on the kind of rivalry which then leads with the arms race. And if you remember the dreadnoughts that Lloyd George built, they doubled the amount of spending on dreadnoughts in the years before the First World War. What impact does that have? And secondly, I'd like to ask particularly to Annika, but I find it almost unbelievable that people can say that after the First World War, Germany didn't talk about the war. The whole of the process up to 1933 and the rise of Hitler was precisely about what the war had caused, the outcome of the war, the Versailles Treaty, all of those things. People came out of the war hating the war. They didn't want another war. And that, it seems to me, is very, very important. In the 20s and 30s, people knew the consequences of the war. And actually, the picture we get of the war today comes from the witnesses to the war. It comes from Robert Graves. It comes from Wilfred Owen. It comes from the people who lived through it, and it comes from All Quiet on the Western Front. It comes from all of those things. And it seems to me we have to actually understand that and not allow the kind of Michael Gove view of the 60s, which made us all soft and we should get back to militarism again.
Annika.
Well, of course, you're right that there is All Quiet on the Western Front, and there is engagement with the war in that way. But I don't think it is the same as it is in this country. It is a different relationship because the attitude towards the First World War in Germany is one of anger. It's a country that does not make its peace with the end of the war in the way that I think Britain does make its peace. The idea is that at least the sacrifices were worth it because this was the war to end all wars, and you can believe that until another war breaks out. Well, in Germany, that's not really the attitude. You are completely right that Versailles and the outcome of the war is a huge topic in Germany, and it is a topic that unites practically every German, regardless of their position. The very left and the very right agree on the fact that Versailles, that the war guilt ruling in particular, has to be undone. That this was a victor's peace. That this is just the most shameful thing, and that is one of the reasons why Hitler comes to power, because he can harness this anger. But it is a completely different attitude to the First World War in Germany to in Britain. So if I said that nobody thinks about the war, that's clearly not the case. But they think of it differently, partly because they lost it and partly because they cannot make their peace with the peace. And so when you then get Hitler in 1937, when he says in the Reichstag, I've finally rubbed out that signature from the treaty that was forced out of us, and I finally returned Germany back from being like a leper among the nations, back to its former glory, then that sort of ends this nearly 20-year struggle, which is all about undoing the outcome of the war. So it's a very different way of relating to the war than there is in this country. And if you're mentioning Remarque, of course, it's very controversial. It's not like here, where most people seem to share this notion that the war was a terrible experience. You mean Remarque's book is one of the ones that gets burned by the Nazis, precisely because that's not what they want to hear. They want to hear that it's going to be okay to fight another war, and this time we're going to win.
So Ernst Junger, it's quite a valuable reading for that perspective.
Yes.
Woman in the black T-shirt.
Thank you. The first thing I was wondering about is the idea of popular consent, which I really just don't buy. Once you were in the trenches, if you didn't go over the top in the trenches, you did face getting shot. So I don't see how you can argue that it is popular consent when it's either go and kill those Germans or kill those British people or get shot yourself. And then the second thing is just really on the idea of sort of Britain good, Germany bad. I mean, would you really argue that is the case? I mean, would you really try and put that argument in somewhere like India, where, or other British colonies where there was no democracy? I just don't buy the idea of Britain as some kind of beacon of democracy and civility.
I don't think anyone is suggesting that, in fairness. I don't think anyone has ever said Germany bad, Britain good on this panel.
Well, that's what...
I think we're dealing with shades of grey there.
Can I answer
well, the gentleman on the end said, I'm very glad that my country went to war, my ancestors went to war and we came out on the winning side. But I think that was my question. I mean, I think it's more complex.
Okay, well, let him answer that then. Gary?
Well, if I take the first one about consent, you're actually wrong about what kept British troops in the trenches. It was very largely a combination of comradeship, belief in cause, really basic things like having the rations arriving on time, mail arriving from home, that sort of thing. 350-ish British soldiers were executed for military crimes during the Great War, out of an army of 5.4 million. 5.4 million or so served in the army at some point during the war. A large number of the people who were executed were repeat offenders. British Army discipline could be pretty harsh, could be pretty brutal, but the idea of people, stood a really good chance of being shot if they deserted or went absent without leave is simply untrue. And a really key reason why people stayed in the trenches was excellent leadership at junior officer level. To put it very crudely, once the public school boys had been killed off at the beginning of the war, they were replaced from people from all parts of society. About 40% of all officers in 1918 were from a lower class or lower middle class background. And they were paternal. They looked after their men. The soldiers were perfectly capable of telling them where to get off if their side of the bargain was broken. There were a few isolated mutinies, but they tended to be very much against local conditions. And that sort of solidarity, which saw the forces of the British Empire through to conclusion in 1918, that solidarity broke down in the French army in 1917, although it was rebuilt. It certainly broke down in the German army in the 100 Days victorious offences of 1918, and Italians and the Austro-Hungarians went much the same way. British really were the only major force whose armies were in the field for any length of time which did not undergo a serious mutiny while the war was going on. Afterwards, different matter. People joined up to beat the Kaiser. They'd done it, they wanted to go home. They did all sorts of things, including burning down Luton Town Hall. But there was a basic commitment to the cause, to their officers, which kept the soldiers going throughout the very grim conditions in the trenches.
Can I paint that in a different light? Because I feature things in a much less cosy way than Gary does, not just in the armed forces, but nationally. But I think that question of popular consent is one where actually the best research historically is now being done, but it's an area where there is more research that's needed. But it seems to me that an awful lot of what that is pointing to is the extent to which the war is experienced at a very, very local level. Right? So not just as Britons or Germans, but inhabitants of counties, of particular towns, particular villages. Right? And I think there is a very interesting question about how the dynamics of consent work at that level. Right? So how is it that at this kind of micro level, societies across Europe, depending on your perspective, are persuaded, are gulled, or persuade themselves to fight? But for me, there can't be much argument that the only way in which these societies can sustain this war for so long is because they have the consent of their populations. So that's not to say this is something which everybody is willingly serving in, because that's obviously not the case. Right? But the majority of the population in all of those combatant countries supports the war for quite a long time. And again, I think that's a question, for me, that's a much more interesting question actually than whose fault is it that the war starts? Right? It's why do so many people across Europe keep fighting it even when it's obvious it's not going to be over quickly, it's going to keep going and it's going to be horrible. But I think that's one, there's an excellent book by Katrina Pennell called A Kingdom United, which looks at responses at this very, very local archival level. And that's, I think, if you want to know more about how people respond to the war, that's where you've got to go back to, is those little local archives, right? And find out what are people doing, how do they respond to this news of the war arriving.
Lady there.
Hi, thanks. Hi, I have a question which I'd like each of the panel members to try and have a stab at. As we've been talking about British Library's Europeana project, next Monday BBC will announce the first, I think it's 200 episodes of 1400 of World War I at home. We are in this situation where we're really kind of contemplating the relationship of the local to the global. What are your kind of hopes and fears and aspirations for what we might achieve through this, talking through this debate within Britain and Britain's place within the world over the next 4 to 5 years?
Neil.
Well, let me say that I'm not terribly interested in Britain's place in the world because I don't see Britain as a unified entity. I see Britain as a class society. And what I'm interested in is the well-being of the great majority of ordinary British people who are at the moment are under massive attack by a neoliberal elite. And we talked a little bit about the Second World War and the legacy of the Second World War, a neoliberal elite that is determined to destroy the greatest achievement of the British people in the 20th century, which is the construction of the welfare state in the 25 years or so after the Second World War. And when you look at who is doing that and who supports that project, it is a neoliberal elite of bankers and industrialists and millionaire politicians. It's the same sort of people, actually, as made the decision to go to war in 1914. So it's not really a question of Britain's position in the world. It's much more a question of how our working people in Britain going to organise themselves along with working people in other countries to resist what is coming down the road. That's partly neoliberal cuts, austerity cuts, which will return us to the kind of position that we were in the interwar period. But it's also about this. It's also about support for new military interventions in other parts of the world designed to shore up the big corporations that are based in the Western world. And we have no interest in those wars as ordinary people, any more than we have any interest in the austerity cuts, but our rulers do. The main enemy is at home, not abroad.
So I think I'll try and answer the question. So my view is that if there's two things I'd like to come out of the next 4 years, one is that some people who don't know anything about the war and think they're not interested in it find out a bit more about it and find out actually they are interested, and that people who already think they know about the war have cause to think about why they know what they know, and they can stick with their opinions or they can change them, but they at least reflect on why do they know what they already know. And if we can manage that, I think there will have been some success. So, fortunately, there's a solution for Neil there, because hopefully what happens is that the process of talking about why do societies consent to fight this war 100 years ago is a way of getting people to think about why do they not conduct greater disruption to stop wars being fought today.
It does seem absolutely crucial, I think, as someone involved in public history, to emphasise the global aspect of the war and to get away from this rather parochial obsession with the Western Front. You know, this took place elsewhere. Countries as Brazil was involved, Turkey, the whole theatre of the Middle East is important. And I think one of the reasons why Christopher Clark's book, The Sleepwalkers, has been a success, not just in Germany but here as well, is because it offers, its focus is essentially on Central Europe, about which many of us, including myself, are very, very ignorant so far as the First World War goes. So I think what we should do over the next few years is to try and open up those vistas and bring... One thing that worries me about the local is the fact that we become obsessed by the local and forget the bigger picture and forget the high politics, forget the diplomacy. They all matter and they all have to be connected. And I think what has happened with the First World War in particular, but a lot of history lately, is it's become focused on the individual and tracing the individual, and it's some kind of search for authenticity. And I don't think that's a good thing. You have to paint the whole picture. Annika.
Yeah, you asked what are we worried about, and it goes, I think, a long way towards what you're saying, but I'm worried about a development of different national stories about the war, and I think that is what's happening, not just with regard to the causes, but with regard to the whole history of the war, that we're not integrating these stories and that we're in danger of having conflicting views of the war, and I don't think that's very helpful. And I'm also a bit worried that we are going to see World War I fatigue setting in before we've got to 2018.
Before we got to August.
Yes, yes.
In the red tie, man in the red tie.
Since we've been talking about Germany, following the fall of the Soviet Union, has there been a reassessment of World War I from a Russian perspective?
Do you know about that? No?
Well, interesting, because I was giving a paper in Cambridge about sort of public history in the war last week, and I was talking to a Russian historian there who said what's striking is how little their interest there is in preserving any bit of First World War history that's left, how little knowledge there is of what little there is that remains, that there's still a very heavy archival presence in all sorts of archives, but that interest in accessing it or doing anything with it it's not part of the story that the Russian regime at the moment wants to tell. I don't know. I mean, again, 2017 is going to be very interesting because it's very hard to see how you could avoid doing something with 2017, but quite how you construct that into a Putinist narrative, I have no idea. But I think that's the great. I mean that's the remembrance in the UK for all that we debated is very easy. if you end up on, if the country ends up on the winning side in two wars, there's not actually that much that's controversial. Whilst there's still a lot we can fight about, empire and all sorts of other things, right? But remembrance for countries that are torn aside by population movements, by genocide, several times over the course of the 20th century is much, much more difficult. Now, how do you, it seems to me the tragedy that we ought to be talking about is not really focusing on Britain at all, but it's what happens on the Eastern Front. And again, maybe that should be our third aim, is if people in Britain at the end of 2018 are cognizant that the war isn't just fought by some khaki figures in a trench somewhere in Belgium with maybe a few field grey Germans on the far side, but that's it, which weirdly is the perspective that some British soldiers have at the time. But there's something else going on the other side of Europe. I think that would be really a really useful development.
The man at the back with the beard.
How the big question, or one of the big questions, is how likely would the Second World War have been if the First World War had never somehow been allayed or had been a minor conflict? Personally, I think there's a good chance it may not have happened, but obviously to do with Hitler's sense of revenge about Versailles and everything. So, how likely is it that Second World War wouldn't have happened?
Gary.
One of the myths of the First World War is that the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 led directly to the outbreak of the Second World War. Sort of, do not pass go, do not collect £200. Actually, there's all sorts of reasons why Versailles might actually have worked. There's a separate argument, which is that the real problem with Versailles, well, there's two things. First of all, that Versailles, having been imposed on the Germans in 1919, the Allies then simply did not enforce it. The French were very keen on enforcing the terms, the British and the Americans much less so, and so the Germans spotted weaknesses which they could exploit. The second argument is that in the Treaty of Versailles brought about actually the worst of all worlds, that actually it enraged the Germans without taking away Germany's ability to resort to arms at some point in the future. Versailles has this reputation as a very harsh, a Carthaginian peace. It wasn't. Something like Brest-Litovsk, imposed on Bolshevik Russia by the Germans in 1918, was a Carthaginian peace. What happens to Germany in 1945 there's no formal peace process at all, but it is the destruction of an existing social system and being rebuilt. Versailles actually is a very traditional form of peace settlement, albeit quite a harsh one, but not harsh enough or not mild enough. In my personal view, the best way to have treated Germany in 1919 would have been to regard the new Republican democratic state as a successor state, and actually blame the ills of the recent past on the now departed imperial government, and basically give Germany a clean slate. That was never going to work in the febrile atmosphere of 1919. It was a non-starter. But there's a very strong argument put forward by Philip Bell and Sir Michael Howard, among other people, that actually what causes the Second World War in the form that we know it is not Versailles, but the Great Depression. Because Germany is becoming reconciled, if not to defeat, certainly being brought back into the family or the wider international community at the end of the 20s. The Wall Street Depression, followed by Wall Street crash, followed by the Depression, smashes that. It wrecks what is left of political stability in Germany. Eventually, of course, brings Hitler to power, even though that is not necessarily a given. Once Hitler is in power, he is a completely different sort of politician than anybody's seen before. He's determined on war from the very beginning, and he wants a major war. I can well imagine that without the Great Depression, without Hitler coming to power, there's further revision of the Versailles Treaty, which is being revised anyway in the 20s, and possibly a small localised border war between Germany and Poland at some stage in which the frontiers are amended, but not the cataclysm we actually get in 1939. So the Second World War is a product of the First World War, that's certainly true, but I don't think there's necessarily a direct line between Versailles and what happens in September 1939.
Thanks, Gary. I'm afraid we've reached the end of the line here. Thankfully, we're not even at August 1914 yet, the anniversary of that. We've got 1915, 16, 17, 18, and even 19 to come. So I've no doubt we'll have many, many more debates. And we can see just how much interest there is in this topic from all of you who've come this evening at such short notice. I'm sure we'll have more of these debates because this is a massive, complex and challenging topic. But thank you for coming, and thank you for the British Library as well for organising this. And thank you to our panellists.